IVM.
2020 is a crazy year for pretty much everyone and everything. It is no different for science, for researchers in life sciences and elsewhere, and for science publishing and science communication as well. Shruti Muralidhar of Scicomm joins me on the Pragati Podcast today to talk to us about how the messy world of scientific publishing is changing in 2020 and how it isn't. Shruti has also written a new policy memo on transforming science communication in India, and we talk about Scicomm in the second half of our episode. And hey, starting this week, new episodes of the Pragati Podcast will be up on Thursday mornings India time. In case you're tuning in for the first time or after a few weeks, the Pragati Podcast is experimenting with rich, interactive episodes that go beyond the audio and the conversation. Now you can check out relevant, related links the moment we discuss specific ideas on the show. You can also take polls while actively listening, and you can also do all of this after you're done listening. Tune into this episode from your browser at tinyurl.com/pragati145 or via the IVM Android app or the Adori iOS app for the full experience. You also don't want to miss the last 10 minutes of this episode where I will for the first time share some insights on how people listen to the Pragati podcast, as well as some results from the first interactive polls that we ran 2 weeks ago. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. We take a step back from noisy political debates and dive into rich conversations on India and the world. I am your host, Pavan Srinath. We'll start this episode's conversation after a short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, as I'm sure you know by now. I would like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. They've been extraordinary sponsors and we couldn't appreciate them more. It's been a really cool week on the network. We've had Ashwin Sanghi on Cyrus Says. We had Masaba Gupta on Advertising is Dead. You should definitely check out Vivek Lath, who showed up on Storytellers and Story Sellers. A close friend and partner of ours, Karthik Paricha, was on the Pragati Podcast talking about the future of podcasting, which I think is really interesting. And I would like to ask people to check out All Things Policy and what they've been doing. They've been having some really interesting discussions about India's challenging relationship with China as we go forward. And I think that would be a great thing for you guys to check out. So with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, and welcome to the Pragati Podcast. I'm Pavan Srinath. Shruti is a postdoctoral researcher at the Pickover Institute at MIT, working in neuroscience on learning and memory. Shruti is also one of the founders of Scicomm, a science communication collective focusing on India. Shruti, welcome to the Pragati Podcast.
Hi, Pavan. Happy to be here.
So, Shruti, I want to talk about science publishing and science communication on our episode today. And I want to start off by talking to you about one of the things that we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic and now in 2020, which has been the rise of preprints. Right? Usually when we think about scientific publications, we think about peer review, we think about journals like Nature and Science, but we've seen, these preprints and, first drafts or second drafts of research that have been coming out at breakneck speed. I checked just earlier this week, there are 6,200 plus preprints that are there that have been published this year on COVID-19 alone across, servers like bioRxiv and medRxiv. So can you maybe start us off by telling us how preprints have perhaps changed the research and knowledge generation space?
Sure. So preprints essentially are a way to get new scientific results out into the common scientific discussion space without waiting for peer review. So it's a way for scientists to, communicate with each other or to share potentially interesting data and, promote sort of free discussion around it, which is actually what peer reviewing does in big journals. But this is a way to sort of bypass that and, directly ask your colleagues, ask your peers for what they think about a potentially new result or a potentially new finding. So these are necessary. I think these are necessary because nowadays standard journals tend to, hide things behind paywalls, which is hard to access. So I think it's great because scientists can bypass that and actually do science or do peer reviewing as it was meant to be. I think they're necessary in an age where standard scientific publishing has also become such a slow and long drawn process. I mean, in my field, in neuroscience, paper submission can take anywhere between like 6 months to a year. And this is after you submit to a journal.
Okay.
So the good point is that I think it's made sharing science more free and less restrictive. And, you're not restricted to only publishing in big journals. You're not restricted to sort of these closed door meetings or conferences that happen only once a year at most. I mean, you can put out a preprint any time of the year. But I think the downside of all of this is that the news media in general and journalists have started using preprints as a source of verified scientific information, which it actually isn't, because it has not been peer reviewed.
And there's a separate question on how good is peer review itself before something is verified scientific information, right? And we've seen a lot of retractions, especially of sort of high impact, big claim papers over the last few years, which have shown that even if something passes through the hallowed gates of peer review, it need not be kosher. It need not be good science.
I mean, but that's like a separate thing, because then you have to question the whole process of peer review, which is a different problem in itself, actually.
Fair enough. I want to get back to preprints, right? So now archive, and this is archive with an X, okay? Until I think COVID-19, I used to pronounce it as archive. And this archive as a preprint server dates back all the way to 1991. I was pleasantly surprised to learn that it's that old. And things like medRxiv and bioRxiv, where a lot of COVID-19 papers are perhaps, 8-9 years old. So this feels like it was at least a partial response to the madness and the extremely long waiting times you described, right, of trying to publish research in peer-reviewed journals. So can you then talk to us about what the conventional publishing process is? Like, with your own experience, what you've seen from your peers, how does this process usually work and how long does it take?
It's probably one of the most painful processes, which any scientist will tell you, which is part of doing science. But yeah, I can give you like a quick glimpse of what it looks like. So like I said, the timeline can range anywhere between, 4 to 6 months to sometimes even a year as a life scientist. And I'm going to tell you what happens, from the time I do the science and onward. So I carry out a study, I find some cool results, and I'm like, hey, this is really nice. I need everybody to know about this. So I write the paper, I put it together, I write a submission letter, which is addressed to, the editor of the journal of my choice. I put everything together in a package and I head over to the journal submission webpage. So I upload everything one by one. They all have their own formats. You enter official affiliation information. I choose between 3 to 5 scientists who I would like to review my work. This is unique, and I guess not all journals do it, but some journals do it. I say, oh, I know so-and-so, X, Y, and Z, I want them to review my work. Sometimes you get to choose up to 3 scientists who you don't want to review your work, and this is due to many things. This is conflict of interest, you're in competition, etc., etc. Lots of information.
I've heard, whispered tales of how, there were competitors who became reviewers of, breakthrough research, and instead of being good reviewers and reviewing the research might copy the work themselves or do something similar in their own lab and put it out faster. So I'm guessing that this is a feature to avoid those issues, right?
Exactly. Yes, like as always, there are bad actors everywhere, and scientists are not, scientists are human. Scientists are not pure beings. So you do all of this, you pay the processing fee, which can range from a couple of $100 to like a couple of $1,000. You wait, and then you just wait. Bunch of things can happen after. So there is the fastest and the most sort of fast turnaround time is a desk rejection. The editor or the journal that you've submitted to is not at all interested in what you've submitted, is not at all interested in the topic of your paper. Usually you get a reply within a week saying, we're sorry, we're not interested. We won't be featuring your work. So this happens within a week at most.
Okay.
If not, the journal editor will then take time, read your submission and be like, oh, okay, maybe this is kind of down our line. They'll usually get back to you with an email within 2 to 3 weeks. It depends really on the journal and how busy they are and how swamped they are with submissions. So the editor will say something like, oh yeah, this is interesting. If they think the story is a good fit for their journal, they will let you know that they're sending the manuscript to potential reviewers. So these might or might not be who you've chosen.
Okay.
They might add some more from their side. They might just, choose the people you've given in your list. It's a single blind thing. So you don't know who your reviewers are, but the reviewers will know who you are.
Okay, so it's not like your affiliations and everything will be taken off the manuscript that goes to them. It's not double blind.
No, it's not double blind. Well, some of them do double blind now, but it's quite rare, I think. It's not as pervasive, at least in life sciences.
Right. And even if you make a double blind based on what papers you've cited, what work you've cited, people can sort of figure out who you might be, right?
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people argue for one or the other. Double blind might advantage some early career researchers. But I mean, considering, like you said, that people eventually end up, sleuthing around and finding everything out, it's just easier if you make it single blind.
Fair enough.
Actually, it's even easier if you make it like not blind at all. But that's a story for another day.
Okay. So reviewers take what kind of time typically to get back to you?
Yeah, so the reviews take anywhere between like a couple of weeks to sometimes couple of months. This is because the reviewers themselves are scientists and they themselves are swamped. I mean, either they're writing their own manuscripts, they're doing their own admin work, they're doing their own science. And so making time to actually review another paper is considered, a service to the community, a service to the profession. And so if they're going to send their reviews back to the journal editor. It's usually a couple of pages. There are major comments, minor comments, any edits they have on the manuscript. And then they also sort of end their review by giving a final recommendation to the journal editor. And they say, okay, we think this paper is good enough to be published in your journal, or I don't think so. Maybe if they do some extra experiments, it can be published in your journal, or, it's a final bam. No, this is a bad paper. I don't think it can be improved anymore. We do not recommend this to be published in your journal.
Okay. So it's a yes, no, or yes, maybe if they do more.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
The editor takes a call on, whether it's feasible, these experiments that the reviewers have asked, whether the overall impression of the paper is positive, whether the overall impression is negative. Is it salvageable? Basically, that's what the editor asks. And then the editor takes a call and then gives me an estimate, I guess, as an author, of what is needed to get the paper accepted. Now, it's quite rare that the paper is accepted with no modifications in the first go. Somebody will have problems. Somebody will have doubts. Somebody will need clarifications. So this repeats actually about 1 to 3 times. Sometimes some questions are just easily answerable, right? I mean, it's a logical question, or it's an explanatory questions, or you just haven't written something properly in your paper. And so, the reviewers will be like, hey, this is not very clear in your text. Can you modify the text, or can you add another paragraph? But sometimes the changes are huge. Things like, oh, you haven't done such and such control experiment. And so you have to add that. And maybe if you add that, we will think about, publishing your paper in our journal. So this depends. So this is what stretches the processing time, and not just stretches, but this whole process repeats about 1 to 3 times.
By the way, dear listeners, if any of you are in any of our interactive players on the IBM Android app, the Adobe iOS app, or on your web browsers, do punch in an answer. I mean, let us know if you're a scientist, how long has it taken for you to publish? What's been the longest time that any publishing process has been like? And I'm curious to know, and I'm sure there are many that stretch close to 10 years, sometimes even worse, right?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on like which field you're in, and like you said, how many people rotate in and out of the project.
And somebody else scoops you in the meantime with some of your results.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I'm sorry, I should have said that. For me, in my head, that's self-evident. So you're always racing against this specter of like a scoop. You're always racing against time to get your work out first.
So I want to then ask you about the beast in the room, right? So these large academic publishing houses, I've seen certain moves over the last decade, maybe decade and a half, where people are getting tired of some of the process that we've seen. On one end, I mean, things take long. Two, the reviewers, as you mentioned, do this as a service. So the incentives are not aligned. It's not like they get paid to review this. Whereas journals either charge you money to publish, or they might charge humongous amounts of money in subscription fees to universities and others, right? So these publishing houses, I understand their value in a time where people had to print and then, distribute physical copies of these journals across the world, and somebody had to do all of it. But in this day and age, are they a remnant and a relic of the past?
This is the big question. Yes, my personal view is yes. The internet has changed everything. We scientists talk to each other a lot more than, a scientist in Germany and a scientist in the US back in the day talked. It has sort of democratized a lot of conversation. And so it is changing. It's time that it changed. I'm just a little sad it's not changing fast enough.
So why is that? Can you sort of walk us through perhaps the political economy of what makes a giant publishing house powerful?
So one of my favorite things that I used to explain this is a Guardian article, which I'm sure we can link to in this part of the podcast. It's this humongous long form article which talks about the history of scientific publishing and how everything came to be the way it is today. And if you read it, I read it, and, sort of the real abstract or the real saransh I can pull out of it is people are greedy. It's a for-profit corporation. People who run it want money, and they've always wanted money, and they want more money. So this is basically the way the system works is you charge the scientists a submission fee, which is at this point, for big journals, it's exorbitant. You charge them submission fee. So you take money from the scientists, you take the scientist's work. The scientist actually gives up the copyright to the journal or to the publishing house, and you sell it back to them. You make them pay for subscription. You make them pay for access to their own work. So when you talk about these big publishing houses like Wiley Blackwell and Pergamon is the old one, but Elsevier and Springer and things like that, they really are nothing but, giant money-making machines. And definitely they are not doing it in a fair and equitable way.
So, Shruti, I understand, and, greed can always be a thing, and monopolistic tendencies are there for all sort of private entities. Everyone wants to be the monopoly and wants to own a particular space. But hasn't competition helped? Have new entrants been able to change this game, or are there misaligned incentives for scientists and others to keep publishing in some of these larger, more established journals which have these, bigger fees and other structures?
So the answer to this is that it's hard to change human behavior. I mean, prestige is still a thing, and people still want to publish in big name journals, especially because it gives them prestige. For younger, early career scientists, it's a question of whether they'll get a job in a first year university versus not get a job at all in a tenure track system. For middle career scientists, it could make or break whether they get the next grant or whether they get the extension to their next grant to do more science. I guess one of the few people who are immune to this are really the late career scientists for whom it really doesn't matter. But by that time, if you've played your cards well and if you've played your cards intelligently, you already have a bunch of papers, in big name journals. It's a sad answer, but the answer is things are not changing fast enough, and prestige is still a very big motivator for a lot of scientists.
So it's not just what is the paper that you've published and what's the quality and the merit and the impact of the results that you've found, but also just where you published it. And that becomes a shorthand for the quality and for the value of what you published.
Precisely. It's like a heuristic, you don't want to spend, if you're sitting on a committee and you're inviting, applications for a new tenure track position, you have to read through possibly 20 or 30, candidates' descriptions. So they're going to have a bunch of things like, description of what they want to do, a plan for their scientific work, and then on top of all of this, you still have to read all their older papers to figure out if they've done good science or not. So it really is about escaping doing all the hard work.
In all of this, right, I have seen, again, moves to counter perhaps not the high impact and sort of the desire to publish in certain journals, but at least the idea of open access, right, where you've had funders starting from the National Institutes of Health in the US, perhaps even some government funders here in India, mandating that if you are publishing this work based on government money, then you have to put this out in the public domain with certain riders. Has that helped? Has that worked? Is that distinct from this open access movement or a part of it? Can you sort of help us make sense of that?
Sure. So they are distinct. They're two different aspects of it. So a preprint access or a preprint server, like I said, it's used for communication between scientists.
Right.
Open access is a mandate that basically says if a piece of scientific work has been funded by the public, it should be available to the public at no cost. So open access movement is basically to make sure that the public gets its value back. The public has put in money to pay you to do science, and they should know what the results are after you finish doing science. So open access journals, as good as they are, which I think they're amazing, there are a lot of open access journals out there, but they still don't directly tackle inherent systemic problems like really high submission fees, or changing the fundamental problems of finding fundamental solutions to problems in peer review, and so on. So open access simply, it just makes sure that the work is available to the public. So in my head, these are the two different sort of aspects of peer review and open access.
I'm going to come to preprints separately, but coming back to open access. So there are two things. One, there are journals which are designed to be open, right? So they don't take money from people who read. So they don't offer subscriptions to universities or individuals, but there might be money that they might take from people who are submitting journals for publication. Is that how it works?
Right. Exactly. There's something called an APC, or an article processing cost. And this is something that the scientists will pay to the open access journal to say, hi, can you use this money and process my journal article?
And usually that money can run up in thousands of dollars, right?
Oh, yeah. Like, for example, eLife is a really famous open access journal. We can check up the exact amount of money, but I think it's at least $1,000, the submission fee.
And the moment you multiply that by 70 or 80 and look at it in rupees, that's a humongous amount of money. And
Absolutely.
Given how poorly PhD students are paid here, or often not even paid regularly, I mean, you're talking multiple months of salary.
Exactly. I do have to clarify here that the grad students themselves are not expected to pay these fees. Usually the fees will come out from the professor in charge, the PI, or the person who heads the lab. But yes, unless the grant that you're on specifically allocates or earmarks money to be used for submission or to be used for article processing when you submit an article, it's just hard. Like, the PIs have to do it themselves. They have to scramble. They have to collect money from possibly multiple grants, or, make sure they have a small pot that they don't touch for like years together, just to make sure that they are not inconvenienced when it comes to, making an actual submission.
And this ultimately means that public money is being used to pay a private journal to publish publicly funded research.
It sounds bad when you say it like that, doesn't it?
And further, I mean, there is also value being added by the peer review process, by whatever hygiene checks that this journal might do. But so far, the evidence says that perhaps the economic value added by the journals is far lesser than the cost involved, right? It's not like the reviewers are getting paid a stipend or an honorarium for doing their review work, being timely with their reviews, or any of that, right?
Absolutely.
So now in all of this, given that you've had preprints, and given that we've had sort of rapid publication of early results, at least on, pressing issues like COVID-19 on these various preprint servers, is it easy once you submit something on preprint server to then get it published in a journal, and where, you are sort of putting your mark in the ground saying you have published these results on so-and-so date, so you have perhaps done this sooner than somebody else, and then you can let this much longer review process happen, but you still get credit for being the first to spot something?
That is a good point. Yes, you do get the credit for being the first, but it doesn't necessarily make the actual journal submission easier.
Does it make it harder?
Occasionally, let's put it that way. I have seen both cases. So I've seen a case where a colleague of mine, they put out the preprint. They put out the preprint because precisely for the reason that you explained, which is, they want a result out first, and then submitted it to like a proper big name journal. And then the editors weren't too happy with it because they were like, well, now that you've put it in the preprint server, it's not really novel, is it? And so that counted as a point against, even though they agreed to, push the paper out to the reviewers and, put it through the process.
So it's like asking for exclusivity, that it's already available in the public domain. Why should we spend resources to put it on our paper?
Exactly. And it also comes down to like copyrights, right? I mean, if whatever you've generated is already out there, the journal can't copyright all the text, all the figures, and all the illustrations. So I guess it makes sense from their point of view because economically they lose a part of their revenue. But that being said, I have seen other examples where, a person puts it out in a preprint server first, and this actually makes the process for a big name journal easier. Because they're like, well, you don't need to, come to our website. So this is what the big name journal essentially said, which is that, well, you don't need to submit everything all over again, because we can just head over to the preprint server ourselves and download everything from there, which essentially cuts a whole, step out from the reviewing process. So it's easier on the author for sure. And it's probably easier on the journal because they don't have to, push multiple documents and multiple packages back and forth.
And now, if I'm not mistaken, there are some journals which openly get mentioned on some of these archives on preprint servers, right? Saying that these journals are willing to accept preprint submissions directly from the preprint server.
Exactly.
So perhaps that is a little bit of the culture change and the system change that we're seeing, where slowly journals are getting more comfortable with the idea of preprints.
Yeah, a lot of the journals that are actually not super duper big names, like not Nature, Cell and Science, but sort of the bread and butter journals, at least in neuroscience, like for example, Journal of Neuroscience has zero problems if you, put up a preprint in an archive, and they will happily take your preprint straight from there. So that is one connection. And the other connection is, which I personally like, is that the archive or the preprint server mentions if and whether that preprint has been published in a big name journal or not. So there's like tagging both ways, which I think is very useful, because you not only have access to the preprint itself, but maybe the paper got better over time through the actual peer review that happened with the big name journal. And you get to see sort of these two different POVs and two different manuscripts and two different documents. And you see how it's become better. And you can kind of infer the process of peer reviewing through that.
Thank you, Shruti. And let's take a quick break and come back and talk about science communication and how we can improve it in India in the second half. And hey folks, in case you've been listening to this episode while busy doing other things, here's a little reminder that you can listen to the episode on your browser at tinyurl.com/pragati145, or just open up your browser's IVM or Odori apps if you're already listening there to check out what links and images we had shared earlier in the first half of this episode, and also key in your responses to the poll questions. If you cannot do this right now, that's perfectly fine. You can do so after listening to the full episode as well. And also, don't miss the last 10 minutes of this episode where I will be sharing some of what we know about how all of you listen to the Pragati Podcast.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
Hi, and welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm here with Shruti Muralidhar today, and we're talking about science publishing and science communication. First off, would you even say that we are in a preprint era, or is this like perhaps a COVID aberration where more people are putting out preprints? Do you think they're here to stay?
I definitely think they're here to stay. I mean, even before COVID hit, preprints were gaining steam very, very fast. At least as a life scientist, I can tell you that, we've jumped into the whole preprint bandwagon. Sort of, it almost feels like somebody's pushed us onto it, but we've jumped onto it very, very fast. And it's changing a lot of the landscape.
So the way perhaps Zoom meetings is changing how meetings are happening across the world, sort of tech adoption, perhaps preprint adoption has also been accelerated in this COVID, and we're not yet in a post-COVID era, but at least in this COVID era.
Yes, most definitely.
I've spoken to several scientists over the years, many who are quite progressive, who like the idea of science communication, which is engaged to the public as well. But there are many who argue that, science communication is scientific publishing. I mean, they are communicating their results to the world, to their peers. And of course, there might be gates involved as to who can read it in terms of physical and monetary gates and paywalls, and in terms of the prior knowledge needed to understand the paper, right? But that itself is communication, right? Where does science communication as Scicomm go beyond it, and how?
So what you just explained, which is scientists talking to each other, is actually something called in-reach, which is peers talking to peers and other experts. It's kind of hard to define. I can't deny that it's a form of communication because, yes, peers are communicating with each other. But as a well accepted definition of what science communication is. I think it's more focused on outreach, which is experts talking to non-experts, or, a scientist talking to somebody who's a non-scientist. And I think, as far as I can see from where I'm standing, it looks like science communication should encompass more of outreach and less of in-reach. I guess you could say that in my head, scientists talking to each other is just peer-to-peer communication.
The other explanation I've seen is, okay, fine, we publish our research, but we also teach. Some of us also write textbooks. So this knowledge is also passed down to students. So there is that reach as well. But you're saying that science communication then will be the third arm, where you sort of look horizontally and go beyond your community of scholars and students and reach out to people who may not be full-time students or even part-time students.
Precisely. And this stems out of the basic idea that a scientist is being paid by the public to do science. And if you go through all your scientific career and all your scientific life without ever interacting with the person who's actually funding you, it's really a crying shame. So doing science communication, which is reaching out to the public, is actually beneficial, or it's actually should be part of all the communications that we do as scientists.
Right. So that is the real question, right? So I think it's fairly common sense, and we can all agree that, yes, good science should be communicated. And hey, good science has been communicated as received wisdom as something. We all know of the equation E is equal to mc square, even if we don't understand it. And that has only become possible because somebody has bothered to communicate the science, right? Or some subset of that science.
Exactly.
So Shruti, then, is the onus of science communication on the scientist, just like the onus is on a scientist to publish their work and, have their work put out in peer-reviewed journals and preprint servers and elsewhere, and do teaching where they're professors as well? Is the onus also on them to communicate their science to the public?
So my answer here, again, at the risk of angering some people, would definitely be a resounding yes. The onus is on the scientists. So ideally, everybody who's connected with science or is doing science should talk about how they use or produce scientific information and how it's going to be more useful to the public, and how it's going to be more useful to them as people. So I guess my point is, if you are working in a scientific field and you produce scientific results, you should do some form of science communication. What form that takes is entirely up to you, what you're comfortable with. In my head, you can even literally just pay money to a professional communicator and say, hi, I'm not very good at doing this, but you know what? I'm at least going to take the effort, take a little bit of money that is part of my grant, give it to a communicator, and make sure they communicate my science well enough to the public.
Okay, so then help me understand what all can be science communication.
For me, in its very essence, science communication is scientists talking to the public, scientists talking to non-scientists. Now, whether they do it through press releases, whether they do it through a talk in the bar, whether they do it through a podcast, whether they do it by writing an article, whether they do it by, going to a stand-up comedy show and, talking about what they do. I think all of these are very valid forms of science communication.
So then it's not about the medium or the format, but about getting the ideas across to various types of people, various sets of people in various different ways.
Precisely.
So now, where does journalism come in here then? How do you see science journalism within science communication?
That's actually a really good point. So journalism, I think, has this dual intent, right? So if there is like a new scientific discovery, a journalist has to explain what that means to the public. But at the same time, a journalist also has to sort of at least try to hold scientists responsible, or hold, the institution of science responsible for any sort of weird things or any wrong things or ethically sort of murky things that they do. So I feel like they have a harder time. I think it's a tougher job, because not only should you be a good communicator, because you don't want to alienate your audience and you do want them to come along with you as you're explaining the science, but at the same time, you should have enough of a backbone to turn around, look at the scientists and look at the institution of science and say, hi, I think what you did was wrong, or why is that happening, or explain that further to me. So yeah, I think that's where science journalism fits. It sort of has a leg on both sides, more or less.
What you're saying really reminds me of some of the work one of the best science writers out there, Ed Yong.
Mm-hmm.
And, he's been doing some great work. There have been so many science journalists and writers who've been doing amazing work during COVID. And a part of that is communicating latest research, the state of what we know in a manner that most of us can understand, right? And then there are various levels of simplification one will have to put in to address specific audiences. Ed Yong from a few years ago was looking at this oxytocin hype that was happening in society and sort of came up with this idea of schmoxytocin, and also wrote long articles on how some scant scientific evidence has been blown up into this mini industry and products and books and advice on how oxytocin can be a game changer in, I don't know, people dating, in relationships, and in so many other things, right? So perhaps that's the dual role you're referring to. It's about busting rubbish at the same time simplifying knowledge.
Precisely, yes. And a lot of people at home in India are doing it very well too. It's not caught on as much, I feel, because it's hard to question the establishment.
And one of the challenges there is the moment you start questioning the establishment, access is cut off.
Exactly, which is kind of hard because I feel like that shouldn't be held over your head to begin with. But hey, we don't live in an ideal world, so it's kind of hard.
So now during COVID, we have seen governments from across the world having very, very different and very problematic ways of communicating what's going on with the public. This can be from data sharing, from regular press releases and press conferences, taking questions during these press conferences, and so on. But at the same time, you've also had a lot of science that is happening, research that is being published, right? So how do you envisage the role of Scicomm and science communication during a pandemic and during a crisis like this?
I think science communicators and science journalists can help sort of separate some of, the wheat from all the chaff. But, it's about helping decipher preprints or, deciding which one is more useful than the other or better than the other is not the primary role of Scicomm, during COVID or otherwise. It's important that, people wait for these papers that are in preprint and to be put through peer review and actually get published, because peer review is the key here. I mean, preprint cannot stand alone by itself. Just because you said it's true, it's not true. It has to be verified. It has to be scrutinized. It has to be, put through all of these checks. I see them going hand in hand. I hope they are going hand in hand, and I do see evidences of it a lot, at least here in the US. Communicators usually refrain from, sensationalizing these one-paper pieces. But at the same time, science journalists also have to do the same thing. They have to wait to see, aggregate a couple of papers together. And journalists have this, like I said before, extra job of making sure that the institution behind it is all clear and there's nothing wrong with it.
Right. And science journalists can't act like reviewer number 3 on a paper, right? I mean, that's not their role. That's not their competence. But they have to do some amount of vetting before they take knowledge from one or two papers or even several papers and then craft that into a message and a story for public consumption.
Precisely. And one of the examples is, you can have a science journalist come and talk to a scientist about what they're doing, but the science journalist also has equal and every right to, go to the competitor, the quote unquote competing scientist or the competitor, and go ask them for, quotes or input on what they think about this new finding. And I think that's a very valid thing to do. And in fact, it should be done more because it gives you a multi-faceted view of what that particular scientific results means, not just in the state of what science is, not just in the status quo of all the science that's evolving, but also how do you place it in the context of society? And is it important or, is it at all as hyped as people think it is, and so on?
Thanks, Shruti. So I finally want to come to India here. Okay. I mean, so far our conversation has been fairly India agnostic. I think most of the challenges that we've discussed do apply to India as well. Perhaps some extra things apply to India as well. But when it comes to science communication, we've seen some of it come of age in the US in the last perhaps decade or two. Can you talk about where science communication is in India, and can you perhaps draw parallels with the US, Europe, or anywhere else as to what's there and what's not there and what can be there?
I think this one's going to get me in trouble because I'm going to start with a very, very controversial statement. As a science communicator, I think Scicomm in earnest doesn't really exist in India. At least not the way I have seen it grow and flourish here in the US with all sorts of, monetary and institutional support. Scicomm in India is not recognized. It's actually not very well understood to begin with. It's completely decentralized with probably, I guess there's one recognized postgraduate course that's offered by a government institution if you want to, study Scicomm or science communication itself.
Okay.
So this lacuna means that you have a huge number of individual players who are fighting for attention. They're definitely not fighting for money, because I can tell you there isn't much money to go around for Scicomm in India. And I'll actually count in Scicomm in that space. I mean, we started because 3 years ago, we got mad that somebody on social media argued that scientists should not be doing Scicomm, and that, all Scicomm is inherently useless, which is such a problematic view to take. So basically what I'm trying to say is that it's a mess, there's nothing formal, there's nothing structured. Most independent, science communicators in India are making little to almost no money doing Scicomm. There are very few official channels to even ask for money from the government, to do Scicomm.
Please help me understand this, right? So now we're not talking about science journalists. I mean, let's make that a separate thing.
Right.
But people in science communication, where would they be? I mean, in an ideal circumstance, would they be embedded into institutions?
When I say science communicators, I do include a huge variety of people. So for me, as a scientist, I will start from myself. I would say a scientist is by default a science communicator. So as a scientist, do you have the framework? Do you have the money? And do you have the access to do science communication?
And that can start with you, I don't know, starting a blog, getting on Twitter, just talking about your work, talking about science.
Precisely.
Okay.
The next level is, okay, you're a scientist who's part of an institution. Does your institution have any department? Does it have like a small communication cell? Do they talk about what goes on in the institute? Is it staffed properly? Does it have an actual communicator? Does it have somebody who knows how social media works? That is also a form of communication. So yes, that's the next level, institutional Scicomm. And then, of course, then I come to sort of this non-organized sector, which is all the independent communicators. So this could be anybody from, say, for example, Kollegala, who is actually a retired scientist, but who is so passionate and so enthusiastic about science communication that he runs his own podcast and he makes his own things and sort of funds himself to make his own science communication material.
Yeah, Kollegala Sharma's, it's called Jana Suddhi in Kannada. I mean, I'm a big fan of what they do. And they put out basically science bulletins and science news in Kannada, and something that well beyond the scope of what I and my co-host try to do on Teleharte, and what he does, and with the regularity of what he does is just phenomenal.
I know, it's mind-blowing.
I mean, just making that depth of knowledge available in Kannada is nigh impossible, but he's making it possible.
Just like him, there are many, many people who are actually experts, or it could even be, Kollegala is part of like a separate sect who are, professionals who are now retired and would still like to give back to the community. But what about undergraduate students, or what about graduate students who want to talk about their work, who are interested in, communicating science? There's like maybe one or two things that they can apply for in terms of money, in terms of training. And it's very highly restricted. So for example, there's the new thing that came up last year, I think, called Avsar. It's not a training process. Avsar is a competition where you send in your write-ups. You explain your research. You write it up in about 2 pages that's accessible to the public. You send it into Avsar. They will pick the best. And it's a competition and you get a prize.
Okay.
I had to sort of, question them on social media and say, hi, this is a competition, but you are not providing the training that's necessary for people to compete in this platform. And so finally, I think they've started, giving some sort of basic training.
And I have heard some sporadic news about science writing workshops and science journalism workshops that are happening at least in some of the more elite institutions in India, right? Like I think NCBS in Bangalore, a few other places like IISc.
Absolutely.
And so that's become a thing just in the last few years.
It has, yes. But also you have to understand that all of these initiatives are either not funded or not recognized, or they just spawned out of like somebody's idea saying, look, we don't have anybody to teach us how to communicate our science. So, let's just come together and like figure it out ourselves. For example, Siddharth Kankaria at NCVS, he runs this really beautiful sort of small journal club called Scicomm Sci, which is basically the science of Scicomm. And he invites peers or experts or, his colleagues to come and talk about, principles of Scicomm or what it is to do Scicomm or what are sort of good practices that you should keep in mind while doing Scicomm. So all of these are very, informal effort. If I was an undergrad and I wanted to become a science communicator, currently I would have no idea where to go at all. So it's an unorganized sector.
I remember conversations even from 12 years ago, 13 years ago. I was fortunate to be in the US then, and there were talks that would happen where people would say, hey, science communication is an actual career option. You don't need to just look at tenure tracks. So it was that recent, even in the United States, that people were talking about this to academics and people sort of studying science to say that, hey, maybe you can think of ideas beyond just, become a postdoc, try for a professorial position and sort of go down that traditional academic route, right? So, and perhaps then we are
absolutely
definitely a couple of decades behind.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So from what I understand, there are nascent initiatives, perhaps by individuals, perhaps by a few institutions who have maybe a certain amount of resources to devote to this. And it's still very much passion and individual driven and not yet systemic, right? But at the same time, our scientific institutions have become more sort of media savvy over the last few years, right? Everyone is on social media now, big institutions, lots of scientists. A few have started blogging. Now there are venues for people to write op-eds as well. So in that sense, do you see organic change happening in the country?
I definitely do. Yeah, I do see organic change happening in the country. And like you said, I can look beyond the first level and see that it's entirely driven only by individuals who, want to push this through. My argument is that it's really high time we formalize this, It's really difficult for people to sustain these kind of efforts on their passion alone, especially if they're not being paid for it.
So Shruti, not just are they not paid, but there are perverse incentives, right? So if a scientist or even a graduate student is not spending, 40, 50, 60 hours a week working on their research, trying to finish their publication-worthy work, everything else becomes a distraction.
Exactly.
There's a huge opportunity cost,
right,
with no incentives which reward you for it.
Absolutely.
Shruti, we are recording this in an important time as well. We have a Science, Technology and Innovation Policy STIP process that is ongoing. There's a Science Policy Forum that has been convened. I think just a day or so before our recording, there was a science communication related discussion as well. So if, as you say, right now, this is largely individual and passion driven, what do you think can be done meaningfully to institutionalize it? What are the big things that India needs to do to reimagine Sciencom?
I have a big wish list. I'm not the only one. Siddharth Kankaria and I, we got together about early this year in January, and we wrote an open letter and we listed all the things that we think should be done almost immediately to help whatever is going on in India. So I'll quickly go through these points. So the first point is that science communicators should have access to scientists, scientific meetings, whether or not they're associated with any institution.
And this is not happening right now.
This is not happening right now because, for example, if you want to attend a scientific meeting, you have to be either a faculty or associated with some research institution to actually gain access to a meeting. If you want to talk to scientists, you cannot talk to scientists because 80-90% of them will not reply to cold call emails. They just won't. And this will happen because, they look at who you are, they will not recognize who you are and just simply choose not to reply to you. A lot of the papers, there are a lot of journals behind paywalls. There are science communication journals. There are articles in science communication journals that, an independent science communicator does not have access to because they have to, spend money of their own and pay to get access to that journal or read that article, which is a shame, really, because we don't have an infrastructure to help our own communicators. So the first thing that should be done is that freelance science communicators should be recognized for who they are and given access to all of these things that will help improve Scicomm in general in India.
Okay.
So that's one.
And this is freelance, as a part-time. This can be anyone who has some interest in science and wants to do this, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
The second is it ties in with the first one, but it's a little more specific in the sense that we really need an open and publicly accessible listing of grants and funding sources. Whether you are a scientist looking to do Scicomm, whether you're a freelance communicator looking to do Scicomm, whether you're a journalist who needs a little extra money, I don't know, to do like an in-depth piece or a long form on, a huge topic, at this point, as of today, we have no idea where we can get money for this from. So there is no listing of grants and there's no listing of funding sources.
For listing, there has to be money in the first place, right? So perhaps part of this is also mainstreaming and incorporating sort of science communication as a budget head into our science funding to begin with, and then make that transparent and accessible as well.
Absolutely, which is what I was coming to next in the first place. So yes, you need to recognize the fact that Scicomm is important. You need to earmark these funds separately. For scientists, they can be, earmarked within the grants that they already get. For freelancers, they could be just simple independent grants that the government offers. I mean, there are 1,000 different ways you can do this. So we need access, we need money. And this money can be used, like I said, by anybody who wants to do any sort of science communication, but it could also be used, for example, to attend international conferences. There are so many conferences that happen in Scicomm all over the world. There are so many workshops and so many sort of very specific courses that happen all over the world. So it's important to give people the means to be able to do this if they want, especially communicators that don't have institutional backing. So that's my second point. The third point is sort of more systemic. So every university, every scientific institute needs to have a fully staffed and functioning communications and outreach department. This is essential because Scicomm cannot survive by, like we said before, passionate, driven individuals alone. You need a systemic response to something like this, and this will help build that framework. So if you have a communications and outreach department and you staff them with people who are trained for that purpose, don't hire a graduate student with zero training in communication as, a science writer or somebody who does public outreach. Find people who are trained for this. Find people who are communicators, and they have to be chosen according to their skill. And this is the most important point, they have to be compensated adequately. Again, this is a question of money. If you're setting up a department, I'm assuming you already have the money, but I'm saying that they should at least be paid properly for what they do. So this sort of compensation is hard to justify because, the example I can give is there are a few institutes in India who actually have a communications and outreach department. But if you sort of scratch the surface and dig deeper, their hiring practices are weird. They're odd. They don't know how to hire because it's basically administrators trying to hire communicators. And secondly, they don't think it's important enough. So, the salary rubric that you see, if you look at some of these positions and if you look at how much they're being paid, it's appalling. Sometimes it's not even like a livable wage, which is a shame, really.
So just like you have the professorial sort of pecking order and so on, currently science communication is fairly low down on that hierarchical rung, right?
Exactly.
Not just in terms of access, but also in terms of income, in terms of billing, in terms of everything else.
Precisely. So, in my dream, in an ideal world, a team that manages the communications and outreach for an institute should include one writer, one public engagement officer, one person who does social media, and one graphic designer at least. So with the writer, you take care of all the text. With the public engagement, you take care of the institutional outreach that the institution can do, like, make science days or open days or invite high school students to come and visit the institutes and so on. A social media manager, this is, again, it's not a trivial thing. I know people think, oh yeah, you get on social media and you put a couple of tweets out, you're all done. It really takes effort and time and skill to manage social media, especially to be like the voice of an institute and interact with people and not just use social media to put out press releases, because that's not what it's intended for. Using social media platforms is to interact with people. So you listen to your audience and you talk to your audience. And finally, one graphic designer, because science art and science graphic design is really coming into its own. It's quite a shame that in India, we really don't have that many people who work at this intersection. So I think this will give designers and artists the opportunity to come. And, their skill sets can be applied to so many things. They can help in making infographics. They can help in making posters. They can help in creating sort of these beautiful slide decks that, either a public engagement officer can use to talk about the work that's going on or supplement the writing that goes on with the writer.
And, perhaps they can persuade scientists to also stop using Comic Sans, right?
Yes.
Because
God.
That's a big crime.
Yes, that's my personal bugaboo also. So thank you for bringing it up. So yeah, so that's like my dream team, for institutional outreach.
And to be specific, this should not be institutional PR, right? Institutional PR might have its role, but that's different.
Exactly.
Because I think in this era where I think the government of India and others have started paying more attention to international rankings of our universities and so on, from what I gather, there is more of an effort to put the institution in a certain image.
Right.
And we've seen the rankings level, we've seen how every time during placement season, there are these fanciful articles that come out about ridiculous pay packages being offered to IIM grads and IIT grads and others.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different ballgame, right? That's not communicating the science. That's projecting the value proposition and the brand of the institution.
Exactly. And you're right. You're absolutely right. And that's different from doing science communication. And like I said, in a dream world, in my head, those would be two completely different departments who would intersect, I don't know, maybe occasionally, to say promote an event where the institute is doing something specific, is actually related to a specific scientific result, a big scientific result that one of the scientists have just done. So then you want them to sort of, work together, shake hands and be like, okay, we're going to promote the institute, but we're also going to promote the science. Those are the only times I see them actually coming together. But in an ideal world, they should be working independent of each other.
Thanks for that. Just a few days before our recording, we had a panel discussion on reimagining science communication in India as well. So between the discussion so far and the mandate of what's happening, what kind of discussions are you seeing on Scicomm?
So the panel was useful because it sort of restated and reframed all the current problems we have with Scicomm in India. But I was kind of sad because it was only very mildly helpful in terms of what should be done next. Like there were very few concrete steps that were discussed or very few policy recommendations that were on the table. And I think this is a little because, the panel composition was a little haphazard. The panel had a science journalist, a science editor, somebody from Vigyan Prasar, a documentary movie maker, and a scientist who does Scicomm in regional languages. And instead of giving us sort of a very synthesized view of how Indian Scicomm looks right now, today, their views were sort of very fragmented. And it was hard for them to grasp how fragmented, Indian Scicomm is today. The good part was, yes, like I said before, some of the problems were restated, and that was good because they needed to be reframed and people needed to know what was going on. But the bad part was, I think it was only mildly helpful. It was not extremely helpful.
So, but Shruti, this panel is just one part of whatever I understand to be the Science Policy Forum process right now, right? So is there like a window that's open where they're taking public inputs into science communication, into science policy and other things?
Yeah, so this is, I guess, a good part. They are taking public comments on what should be concrete steps that could go as part of this huge science, technology and innovation public policy that they're drafting. And this window is open, I guess, until the thematic groups are over and even a little longer. I have put together a policy brief or a memo with all the concrete steps that I think should be taken in view of improving Scicomm in India. You should find the link as you're listening to this podcast, and you should also find it in the episode description.
Thank you, Shruti. That will be really helpful. So, Shruti, thank you so much for joining me on the Pragati Podcast and really walking us through science publishing, science communication, and how at least we can reimagine Scicomm in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was definitely a pleasure.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for staying tuned till the end. As I had mentioned earlier in this episode, I wanted to share a little about how all of you listen to the Pragati Podcast and what new things we've learned via listener polls on episode 143 a couple of weeks ago. This is data from the first 10 days of listening, and we learn a lot more over time, and I'll keep sharing all that I can. I just want to mention that we don't harvest any personal information that goes completely against the ethos of what any of us stand for, and we only receive some aggregate statistics on episode listening and downloads and fully anonymized results from polls. So here are a few things on how people typically listen to the Pragati Podcast. Usually we have about 25 to 30% of our listeners tuning in on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, and this can be across iPhones, iPads, Apple Watches, and everything else. This number is probably true of most shows even in Android-heavy India, because Apple has been leading the way in making podcast listening as a default activity on all their devices for quite a while now. Beyond this 25 to 30%, about 10 to 15% of people listen in via browsers. Sometimes this is how people discover an episode or discover the show before using an app, and occasionally people prefer to stick to browsers for their listening. The remaining 60 to 65% of you, my dear listeners, tune in from a variety of Android and iOS apps. I can see that all of you love your favorite podcast apps, and I love that podcasting is still a medium where you can listen in however you like and from wherever you like. Castbox, Spotify, Pocket Casts, Google Podcasts, the IVM Android app, these are among the more popular choices for listening, but each app has a small share, and overall there are easily 50 plus different apps that people use. There is one big thing that we've noticed this year, not just on Pragati, but I think across many shows. Before the pandemic and the lockdown, we used to see an 80-20 split between mobile and desktop listening on Pragati. But what we can see quite clearly since April is that so many of you are tuning in from computers now. And from an 80-20, the split is closer to 70-30 or 65-35 between mobile and smart devices versus laptops and desktops. Here I really want to say thank you so much to all of you for continuing to take the time to tune into the Pragati podcast through these tumultuous times, where all our habits and our routines have been upended on their head. And for almost every single person who has found it more difficult to listen to podcasts because they're no longer commuting to work or spending time at the gym, there's someone else who's found the time to make podcasts a part of their daily or weekly routine. Our interactive poll data, though preliminary, underscored some of this. For a full half of the people taking the poll, how they listen to podcasts and what they're doing while listening varies a lot between each episode and between each show. I completely love this. Another 40% of listeners are usually active on the phone or their PC doing other things while listening. And a small but significant 10 to 15% do pure listening and nothing else while tuning in. One surprising thing that I found was that among the people taking the poll, about 60% of you had mostly unchanged listening patterns through the year of 2020. Another 30% had either changed when they usually listen to the Pragati podcast or had switched listening devices from phone to PC. From another poll in episode 143, we found that at least for this meta episode on podcasting, a full 50% of you had been listening to podcasts since 2017 and much earlier. And a good 20 to 25% of you have started just in 2020. This is such a marvel to discover, and again, I'm eternally grateful to each one of you who takes the time to tune in, actually listen to these fairly long episodes on public policy and a whole bunch of other things. Coming to our interactive experiment using the Adori players, overall for episode 143 with Karthik Parija, about 10 to 15% of you listened in to our interactive podcast players. It was really straightforward to see that many of you have taken the time to switch apps to check out what our new episode formats have to offer, and many of you had clicked on the links that are relevant to you and had also participated heavily in the polls. Thank you again. Often podcasting feels like it's conversations or, monologues like this going into the ether. And the number of downloads and other metrics that I get to see don't quite capture a true sense of how much any of you felt for an episode. Apart from getting to chat with some of you on social media, especially Twitter, this engagement on our web, Adori and IVM app players is really heartening for me to see. And inshallah, we can do a lot more in the coming weeks and months. Our upcoming episodes will continue to be interactive and rich with links, polls, and illustrations while ensuring that the audio and our conversation remains paramount. Thank you so much for tuning in, and hey, no matter where you're listening to this episode right now, you can still go to tinyurl.com/pragati145 after you're done listening from your favorite app, and you can use the web player to check out what links we've shared and key in your answers to our polls. It's remarkably simple. The Pragati Podcast is made possible thanks to the support of the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public-Spirited Media Foundation, IPSMF. Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or comments, do write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us.
The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहाँ प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
We are from the Open Library Project and we host a podcast called Paperback.
Paperback is a podcast where we engage with stalwarts and experts from various industries, suggesting non-fiction titles that contributed to their journey in a big way.
We've had guests like Anjali Raina, Dr. Marcus Rani, Dr. Swati Lodha, Ambi Parmeswaran, Apurva Damani, and many more on our show Paperback. Find new episodes every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.